The doors do not open from the inside. That is the first thing you need to understand about where Bryan Kohberger is right now. Every door in that facility opens and closes on a timer controlled by someone else. Every movement he makes inside those walls is authorized by someone else. Every hour of his day is structured by a system that does not negotiate, does not respond to formal language, and does not care who he was before he arrived. For a man who spent his entire adult life engineering the way the world perceived him, that is not just incarceration. That is something far more specific. That is the complete removal of every tool he ever used to survive. And what happened next, what the people inside that facility began to document within days of his arrival, is something that has not been examined anywhere with this level of detail until now. If you are new here, you are watching Keith's Crime Files. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because every video on this channel is built on documented facts, verified sources, and the kind of depth that most true crime coverage never reaches. Like this video if you want to see more. Now let's get into it. On July 23, 2025, Bryan Christopher Kohberger was sentenced in Ada County, Idaho. Judge Stephen Hippler handed down 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary, and ordered him to pay $270,000 in fines. Before delivering the sentence, Judge Hippler stated plainly from the bench that he could find nothing redeeming about the man standing before him. Kohberger did not react. His face did not change. His posture did not shift. In over 2 years of court proceedings, he had never given the room anything they could visibly use against him, and he did not give them anything in that moment either. 6 days later, on July 29, 2025, he was transferred to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho. He was assigned inmate number 6321 and placed on JB Block, long-term restrictive housing. His daily conditions were as follows: 23 hours inside a single cell, 1 hour of outdoor time in a secured concrete enclosure that corrections officers refer to simply as the cage, physical restraints during every movement within the facility, and a shower every other day. 1 day after arriving on that block, he filed his first formal complaint. To understand why that detail matters, you first have to understand who walked through those doors. Because Bryan Kohberger did not arrive at that institution as a broken man. He did not arrive confused or uncertain about who he was. He arrived as someone who had spent his entire adult life doing one thing with remarkable consistency: rebuilding himself, from the outside in, over and over again, until the version the world saw bore almost no resemblance to whatever existed underneath. Kohberger grew up in the Pocono Mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. As a teenager, he was severely overweight, socially isolated, and by multiple documented accounts, a consistent target for bullying. He wrote about it himself in online posts from that period, describing himself in his own words as an organic sack of meat with no self-worth. Then, somewhere around the age of 15, something changed. Within less than a year, he lost approximately 130 pounds. Not gradually, not slowly. By every account from people who witnessed it, the transformation was obsessive and relentless. Extreme dietary restriction, punishing physical training, kickboxing. The weight came off so rapidly, it produced medical complications. He developed an eating disorder severe enough to require hospitalization, and he later underwent surgery to remove excess skin. He would go on to reference this transformation on a job application, describing it as evidence of his dedication and discipline. But the people who had known him before noticed something that went beyond the physical change. The quiet, withdrawn teenager who had been an easy target did not become warmer or more open. He became colder, more controlled, more assertive in a way that made the people around him uncomfortable rather than at ease. Classmates who had known him for years described it as watching an entirely different person inhabit the same face. He had not healed what was on the inside. He had rebuilt the outside and decided that was enough. That pattern, did not stop there. In the years that followed, Kohberger fell into substance use. First marijuana, then heroin. Friends from that period described someone searching for belonging, for validation, for a group that would accept him without conditions. The addiction took hold seriously enough that he stole his own sister Melissa's phone and sold it to fund his habit. His sister later told the New York Times in 2026 that the family had genuinely feared they might lose him. He entered treatment. He pulled himself out, and then he rebuilt himself again. This time, the identity he constructed was the academic, the criminologist, the person who understood how dangerous minds worked because he had studied them from the inside out. He earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in criminal justice from DeSales University in Pennsylvania. His academic mentor there was Dr. Catherine Ramsland, one of the most respected forensic psychologists in the country, a researcher who had personally interviewed BTK killer Dennis Rader and co-written a book with him about his own crimes. Ramsland taught Kohberger courses on antisocial behavior, on the psychology of serial offenders, and on the internal logic of people who commit extreme acts of premeditated violence. After Kohberger entered his guilty plea in July 2025, Dr. Ramsland spoke publicly for the first time about her former student. She told News Nation that she now wondered whether her own curriculum had in some way inspired him. She said she wanted to study him specifically to understand how she had been completely fooled. A woman who had spent her career sitting across from the most documented violent offenders in American history had interacted with Bryan Kohberger repeatedly and seen nothing that alarmed her. That is not a minor detail. That is a profile. From DeSales, Kohberger moved to Washington State University in Pullman to pursue his doctorate in criminology. WSU sits approximately 8 miles from Moscow, Idaho. He began the program in August 2022, 3 months before the murders at 1122 King Road. His doctoral research, reviewed by committee members after his arrest, focused on criminal decision-making and the psychological processes behind specific categories of premeditated offenses. By academic definition, he was an expert on how people who plan serious crimes think before, during, and after the act. Colleagues at WSU, who later spoke to investigators, described him differently than his credentials suggested. They said he performed intelligence as a social tool, rather than as a genuine mode of engagement. Pleasant in appearance, strategic in reality, someone who studied the behavior of others, not to connect with them, but to manage them. When digital forensics analysts examined his phone after his arrest, what they found reinforced that description in ways that stayed with them professionally. He had taken photographs of himself alone in private, front, side, back, different expressions, repeated over and over, never shared with anyone, never posted anywhere. Just for himself. When investigators later asked him what his favorite film was, he answered without hesitation, American Psycho, the film about a man so consumed by his own reflection that the world around him existed only as an audience for an identity he had assembled entirely from the exterior. On July 2, 2025, Kohberger walked into a courtroom in Boise wearing a button-down shirt, a tie, and khakis. He greeted his defense team and his parents with a warm smile. When Judge Hippler began the proceedings, Kohberger answered each question with a single word. Yes, 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 once for each victim's name. It was the first time he had spoken aloud in court in over 2 years. 3 weeks later, he was in a cell on JB Block, and the constructed exterior that had held together through every proceeding, every hearing, and every media moment had nowhere left to perform. The Idaho Maximum Security Institution is not designed for rehabilitation. It is designed to contain, and the conditions on JB Block operate on a set of rules that do not bend, regardless of who a person was before they arrived, regardless of how they carry themselves, regardless of academic credentials or courtroom composure. On July 30th, 2025, one day after being placed on that block, Kohberger filed his first formal complaint. The handwritten resident concern form, obtained by the New York Post and News Nation, was structured, measured, and addressed formally to the deputy warden. He described the environment on Unit 2 of JB Block as one he wished to transfer from. He referenced what he called verbal threats and harassment. He requested a specific transfer, not simply out of JB Block, but to B&B Block, a different and quieter wing of the facility. He was not asking, he was filing. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Asking is what a person in distress does. Filing is what someone does when they believe the system around them is still obligated to process their requests through formal channels, when they still, on some level, believe the rules apply to them in a way that requires a response. The very next day, the 31st of July, he filed a second complaint. This one was about food. Kohberger is a documented vegan, confirmed by former classmates, confirmed by faculty at WSU, with one professor noting he ate only one meal per day and maintained strict dietary rules. The prison provides vegan meal options. His second grievance alleged that items had been repeatedly missing from his tray, and that the nutritional standard was not being met. He also filed a separate complaint about the quality of the bananas. The instinct when encountering that detail is to treat it as minor. Forensic psychologists who have reviewed his documented behavioral pattern would disagree. A person in genuine psychological crisis inside a maximum security prison does not produce formal written grievances about fruit. A person who is still operating from an internal position of assumed entitlement does. The complaint continued from there, but before examining what came next inside those walls, there is a layer to this story that most coverage overlooked entirely. During the 2.5 years Kohberger spent at Latah County Jail awaiting trial, he was housed in close proximity to other inmates. When investigators later interviewed those inmates as part of the case documentation process, what emerged, independently, separately, without coordination between them, was consistent enough to constitute a pattern. One inmate, housed directly next to Kohberger between August and September of 2024, told investigators that Kohberger was the most intelligent person he had encountered inside that facility. He then described him as deeply annoying. The reason was behavioral. Kohberger washed his hands an extraordinary number of times every single day. Multiple investigators and corrections staff confirmed this independently. Court TV reported that people who observed him at close range said he went through 3 standard-size bars of soap every week. His hands were visibly and chronically red from the frequency. He spent between 45 minutes and a full hour in the shower, and at night he almost never slept. He paced. He moved. He remained in near constant motion through the hours when the rest of the unit was quiet, then rested during daylight hours. The inmate in the neighboring cell told investigators the sounds through the wall kept him awake. The constant movement, the restlessness, the inability to simply stop. That same inmate then described a specific moment that is difficult to set aside once you hear it. He was watching a sports game on the jailhouse television and yelled something at the screen, a frustrated comment about a player. Kohberger, who was at that moment on a video call with his mother in the next cell, immediately ended the call, walked to the bars, and aggressively demanded to know whether the comment had been directed at him or at his mother. The inmate was talking about a football player. Kohberger's response was not confused, not curious. It was aggressive and immediate, a reaction completely disproportionate to anything that had actually occurred. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the documented behavioral reports described this kind of response as a hallmark of someone with an acutely fragile sense of self, a person who cannot tolerate even the possibility of being disrespected, even accidentally, even by a stranger reacting to a television. A separate inmate, interviewed in a different investigative document, told investigators that if not for concern about legal consequences, he would have physically confronted Kohberger. Not because Kohberger was threatening him, but because of what being near him felt like. That same inmate used 4 words that investigators recorded in their report. His eyes tell a story. These are not easily rattled individuals. These are people inside a maximum security holding facility who have seen and experienced things most people will never encounter. And Bryan Kohberger, composed, credentialed, controlled, made them deeply uncomfortable. Not through action, through presence. In under 30 days, Bryan Kohberger had filed 5 formal complaints: food quality, transfer requests, meal tray contents, the vent harassment, environmental concerns about his housing unit. Each one written with the same structured, formal language. Each one treated by the institution as documentation, not as a demand requiring immediate resolution. There is a category of environment where the filing system exists, the forms exist, the documentation process exists, and none of it changes anything. The decision was made the moment he walked through those doors. Everything after that is paperwork. August 12th, 2025. 20 days after sentencing, Kohberger was granted a formal housing placement hearing before a 3-member Idaho Department of Corrections committee. He had 2 requests on the table: a transfer out of JB Block and formal reclassification under protective custody. He walked into that room prepared. His presentation was structured, measured, and professionally framed. He referenced the ongoing harassment through the vent system. He spoke the language of someone who understood how correctional institutions operate. He made his position sound reasonable, collaborative, and difficult to deny. And then he said something that stopped the room. In the middle of arguing that he needed protection, Kohberger calmly acknowledged that the harassment would likely die down on its own once media coverage of his case faded from public attention. He was not expressing fear. He was not asking for sympathy. He had already analyzed why the inmates were targeting him, assessed the social dynamics at play, and diagnosed the situation with the detachment of a researcher reviewing field data. Then he went further. He told the committee that he eventually wanted to work inside the prison, to be productive, to participate in shared recreation like any other long-term inmate. He pointed to a specific high-profile fellow resident on his block as a model for how that integration could work. The committee was not moved. Both requests were denied. Their documented reasoning was precise. Administrative segregation, they concluded, remains the best course of action for the protection of staff, other residents, and Kohberger himself. He went back to the cell. The door closed on a timer. Nothing changed. What that hearing actually revealed goes beyond the denied requests. Every school he attended had responded to careful presentation. Every formal setting he had ever navigated had responded to it. Every committee, every academic department, every professional environment he had ever entered had given him something back when he performed correctly. This one did not. And that, for Bryan Kohberger, was something he had no existing framework to process. 3 days later, on August 15th, 2025, a video surfaced online. It spread quickly. Reddit threads first, then true crime communities on social media, then platforms with audiences in the hundreds of thousands. The footage showed a man inside a small prison cell in prison-issued clothing, doing something that looked, at first glance, completely ordinary. He was cleaning his shoes, slowly, methodically, the same motion repeated with a cloth, unhurried, focused entirely on the repetition. The Idaho Department of Corrections responded immediately. They confirmed they were aware of the footage, that an investigation had been launched, and that if the video were verified as authentic, it would represent a clear violation of department policy. By September 2025, they confirmed it was real. By October 2025, investigators had identified the employee responsible. That person had already resigned. Idaho State Police reviewed the case and determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges under Idaho law. No prosecution, just a resignation. But here is what the footage actually produced that no one had planned for. It confirmed on camera what had already been documented separately by corrections staff and fellow inmates through independent observation over more than 2 years. The slow, deliberate, repetitive physical behavior, the self-contained ritual, the same pattern described by people who had never compared notes, now captured on recorded footage inside Idaho Maximum Security Institution. Clinical psychologists who reviewed the documented behavioral pattern described it as consistent with a compulsive need to manufacture structure and order through physical repetition. When the external environment offers neither, a person creating the experience of control in a space where almost none exists. Forensic psychology literature also addresses a specific and well-documented relationship between sustained compulsive cleansing behavior and the psychological weight carried by individuals who have committed serious, premeditated offenses. It is not speculation. It is studied. It is documented. Clinicians who work inside correctional facilities have observed it across multiple cases. Whether that clinical framework applies directly here is a determination for professionals. But the behavior was real, the pattern was consistent, and the footage removed any remaining doubt about that. The Idaho Department of Corrections never intended for that video to exist. What it gave the public entirely by accident was the most unguarded image of Kohberger that anyone had ever seen. Not the structured complaint letters, not the measured hearing presentation. Just a man alone in a cell, repeating the same motion, with nothing left to manage and no outcome left to influence. While all of this was unfolding inside that facility, something else was happening on the outside. A book was being written. In early 2026, author Christopher Whitcomb published a work titled Broken Play. Whitcomb had obtained access to materials that were never presented in any courtroom, because there was never a trial. What he found inside those materials raised a question that has quietly followed this case ever since. The central piece of physical evidence connecting Kohberger to the crime scene was a K-bar knife sheath found at 1122 King Road. DNA recovered from that sheath was tested and matched Kohberger. Prosecutors described it at the plea hearing as the single strongest physical connection between him and the 4 people he admitted to killing, the anchor of the physical case. Before the plea was entered, Kohberger's defense team hired forensic scientist and criminologist Brent Turvey to independently analyze the evidence. Turvey examined the knife sheath. Specifically, he examined the chain of custody documentation, the official record that is supposed to account for every single time a piece of evidence is handled, moved, or accessed from the moment it is collected to the moment it reaches a courtroom. What Turvey found was this. The chain of custody documentation for the sheath appeared to have been completed in 2 separate instances, once on the evidence bag itself, and a second time on a sticker affixed to the front of that same bag. The earliest date visible on the original bag included initials attributed to lead detective Brett Payne, dated November 14, 2022, the day the crime scene was processed. The sticker version appeared to have been completed separately, at a different point in time. Turvey's conclusion, as reported by Whitcomb, was direct. He stated that if this case had gone to trial, that piece of evidence should have been ruled inadmissible by any competent judge. He went further. He stated that if the DNA from the sheath were excluded from the trial evidence, what remained was a white vehicle and cell tower location data, and that in his professional assessment, that would have been the most significant evidentiary problem the prosecution faced. This requires precision. None of this changes what Bryan Kohberger confirmed in that Boise courtroom on July 2nd, 2025. His guilty plea is on the record. His admissions under direct questioning by Judge Hippler are on the record. None of that is in dispute here. What this does raise is something more specific and more unsettling. The case that a jury would have seen, the evidence that would have been presented, argued, and weighed by 12 people in a deliberation room, may have been materially weaker than the public was ever told, and Kohberger's defense team knew exactly what they were looking at before the plea agreement was signed, which brings the question into focus in a way that has never been fully examined publicly. Did Bryan Kohberger take that plea because he had no viable alternative, or did he and his legal team assess the evidentiary landscape, calculate the realistic outcome of a trial, and determine that accepting 4 life sentences was the more controlled result than gambling on what a jury would actually be allowed to see? Lead prosecutor Bill Thompson gave a partial answer at sentencing. He stated publicly that he had deliberately chosen not to require Kohberger to explain his motive as a condition of the plea agreement. His reasoning was stated plainly. He said he did not believe anything that came out of Kohberger's mouth would be truthful. He said he did not want to provide a platform for whatever self-serving narrative had been prepared. Thompson removed the microphone on purpose. Both men walked out of that agreement having received something specific. Thompson received the conviction, the life sentence, and the silence. Kohberger received his life and kept his motive sealed permanently inside an agreement that neither side can now reopen. He waived his right to appeal as a condition of the deal. The chain of custody question will not be litigated. The jury that never formed will never weigh in. The case that might have looked different at trial is now closed. And in a cell in Kuna, Idaho, the man at the center of all of it continues to file complaints about his meal tray. January 7th, 2026. While Kohberger remained on JB Block, 4 families walked into a courthouse and filed a civil lawsuit. Not against Kohberger. He has nothing left to give them. The lawsuit was filed against Washington State University. The institution that employed him paid him a teaching stipend, covered his tuition, provided him with on-campus housing, and gave him direct professional access to students, all while receiving documented complaint after documented complaint about his conduct toward women on that campus. The lawsuit, filed in Whitman County Superior Court and later proceeding in federal court in the Western District of Washington, was brought by the parents of all 4 victims: Steve Goncalves, Karen Laramie, Jeffrey Kernodle, and Stacy Chapin. Their legal complaint alleged that Washington State University received at least 13 formal reports of Kohberger's inappropriate, threatening, and predatory behavior toward female students and staff before November 2022. 13 documented reports. From the time he arrived on that campus, students described him blocking exits, standing too close, and following women to their vehicles. One graduate student described him to investigators as the type of person she immediately recognized as a stalker. Another described being verbally targeted by him and said he carried what she called a built-up fury, a barely contained rage that existed underneath the composed exterior he presented to the world. A WSU employee created a private internal alert system specifically because of him. If you were alone with Kohberger and felt threatened, you sent an email to a designated address with the subject line 911. A faculty meeting was convened about his behavior. At that meeting, one professor, whose name remains redacted in the available documents, said something that no one who has read it has been able to set aside. She stated on the record, in front of colleagues, that if WSU granted him a doctorate, he would become the professor who in 4 years would be harassing, stalking, and causing serious harm to his own students. She was right about the outcome. She was only wrong about the timeline. It was not 4 years. It was months. WSU's legal response denied institutional responsibility. They argued the murders were caused by Kohberger alone, and not by any failure of the university. They argued the families had missed the applicable statute of limitations. They argued that a graduate student committing mass murder was not something a university could reasonably have foreseen. As of April 2026, the lawsuit is actively proceeding, with the families having submitted a witness list of 69% individuals. And that is where everything stands right now. Bryan Kohberger is in a cell in Kuna, Idaho. He cannot file a complaint that changes anything. He cannot influence a single variable of his daily existence through presentation, framing, or carefully structured language. Outside those walls, accountability is moving through legal channels he will never have access to. In courtrooms he will never enter. Over institutional decisions he played no part in making. Through a civil process that does not require his participation or his silence, or anything from him at all. The families of Ethan Chapin, Zana Kernodle, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Goncalves are still in those courtrooms, still building their case, still pursuing answers through every available legal avenue. The process did not end when the plea was signed. It redirected, and in the middle of all of it, behind razor wire and reinforced steel, in a cell that opens and closes on a timer controlled by someone else, sits a man who spent his entire adult life believing that the right performance, delivered to the right audience, could change any outcome. He has now spent months inside an environment that has proven, every single day, that he was wrong. That is what prison revealed about Bryan Kohberger. Not a monster, not a mystery, a pattern. Consistent, documented, and now fully visible for the first time without anything left to conceal it. If this level of research is what you have been looking for, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Keith's Crime Files right now, and hit the like button before you leave. Every video on this channel is built on verified records, confirmed sources, and the kind of depth that the headlines never reach. We will see you in the next one.